young widow returned to her husband's forgotten farm and found a hidden horse no one knew. The lock on the stable door had rusted shut from the inside, not the outside. That detail would matter later. For now, all Aurelia Vance saw was a padlock the color of dried blood, bolted to a door that had not been opened in 11 months, and a sound behind it that should not have existed. A slow, deliberate scrape of a hoof against rotted wood. Something alive, breathing in the dark, waiting for a hand that never came. She did not know yet that her husband had died with a secret folded so tightly into the walls of this farm that even grief would not be enough to pry it loose. She only knew that the letter from the county had said the property was hers, that the debts were hers, and that the man who once promised her forever had apparently kept an animal locked in a barn he swore, 3 years ago, he would never buy. Before this story continues, if you are watching from a small town where silence sometimes says more than a whole conversation, type your city in the comments below. If you have ever inherited more grief than answers, press like and subscribe, because what Aurelia Vance finds beneath that stable floor will change the way you think about the man she buried. Now, let the story begin. The fog over the Willamette Hills that October did not lift so much as retreat, curling back from the fence line like something reluctant to leave. Aurelia stood at the end of the gravel drive with a single suitcase and a folder of legal documents pressed to her chest, looking at a house she had visited exactly 4 times in 6 years of marriage. Each time, Daniel had found a reason to leave before nightfall. She had never asked why. That, she was beginning to understand, had been her first mistake. The house itself was modest by the standards of the city she'd grown up in. A 2-story farmhouse with white paint gone the color of old teeth, a wraparound porch missing 2 of its rails, and gutters clogged with a season's worth of fir needles. Behind it, past a stretch of overgrown pasture, stood the barn, larger than the house, better maintained, if only barely. Its roof had been patched in places with fresh tin, bright and out of place against the weathered gray boards beneath it, as though someone had cared for this structure long after they had stopped caring for anything else. Aurelia had buried her husband in a cemetery 2 hours from here, in a suit she had chosen because it was the one he wore in their wedding photographs. She had shaken the hands of people she did not recognize, colleagues from the veterinary supply company where he worked 3 days a week, men who mentioned a farm in passing as though she should have known its name, its history, its weight. She had smiled and nodded and said nothing, because saying something would have meant admitting she did not know where her husband went the other 4 days of the week. The lawyer had called it an oversight. A property purchased under a limited partnership 2 years into their marriage, its existence buried in paperwork that never crossed her desk because Daniel handled, in his words, the boring parts. She had believed him. She had believed a great many things. Now she stood at the edge of a farm worth less than the debts attached to it, in a county she had never lived in, holding keys to buildings she had never entered, breathing air that smelled of wet cedar and something else beneath it, something animal and close. The first thing she noticed, walking the porch steps, was that someone had swept them recently. Not the fine dust of neglect settled over weeks, but the coarse debris of days. A boot print, half-formed, at the threshold. She looked behind her at the empty drive, at the fog pooling low over the fields, and felt the particular cold that has nothing to do with weather. She let herself in with a key that still smelled faintly of machine oil, as though it had been used the week before rather than sitting in a lawyer's envelope. Inside, dust sheets covered the furniture in the front room, but the kitchen told a different story. A single chair pulled out from the table, a mug in the sink, rinsed but not washed, a thin brown ring at its base. A calendar on the wall, months out of date, but circled in red on a day in March. She stepped closer. The circle sat around no holiday, no birthday she recognized. Just a Tuesday, ordinary in every visible way, made significant by a hand that was no longer alive to explain it. She spent that first night in the guest room rather than what would have been their room, unable to look at a bed she had never shared with him in this house, telling herself it was practicality and knowing it was cowardice. Sleep came in fragments, broken by a wind that pushed against the windows like something testing for weakness, and by a sound, distant and rhythmic, that she told herself was a loose shutter. It was not a shutter. In the morning, she found the barn locked from a padlock newer than anything else on the property, its metal clean where the rest of the farm had surrendered to rust. She stood before it for a long moment, palm flat against the wood, feeling a vibration that traveled up through her arm before she understood what it was. A body, shifting weight on the other side. Not a machine. Not the wind. Something was breathing in there. Something had been breathing in there for a long time. She did not have a key for that lock. The lawyer's envelope, when she checked it again with hands that were not quite steady, contained keys for the house, the tool shed, the old milking parlor long since converted to storage. Nothing for the stable. Whatever Daniel had kept behind that door, he had kept it from everyone, including the woman who had promised to know his whole life. That evening, walking the fence line as the fog rolled back in, she noticed the pattern in the grass before she understood its meaning. A worn path, narrow and deliberate, leading not from the house to the barn, but from the barn to a stretch of trees at the property's edge, and beyond that, out of sight. Someone, or something, had walked that path so many times it had stopped being grass and started being memory. She followed it as far as the tree line before the fog swallowed the way forward, and stood there with her arms wrapped around herself, looking at a wall of white that gave back nothing. Behind her, faint but unmistakable, the barn made its sound again. A low exhale, a shift of weight against old wood. Whatever was locked inside had been waiting for a very long time, and for reasons she could not yet name. Standing in that darkening pasture with her husband 11 months dead and 100 questions she had never known to ask, Aurelia understood with a clarity that frightened her more than the cold. It was still waiting. The nearest town was called Larkspur Hollow, a name too pretty for the 4 blocks of hardware store, feed supply, diner, and church that made up its center. Aurelia drove there the next morning less for supplies than for information. The feed store owner, a heavy-set woman named Odette with forearms like a boxer's and eyes that missed nothing, looked at her for a long moment when she gave her name. "You're the wife," Odette said. Not a question. The word wife carried a weight Aurelia did not understand yet. Something between sympathy and suspicion, as though widowhood in this town meant something more complicated than grief. "Word travels fast," Aurelia said, keeping her voice even. "Small towns don't need telephones," Odette said, already turning to ring up a bag of feed Aurelia hadn't asked for. "Your husband bought this same order every month for 3 years. Never missed once. Rain, snow, didn't matter. Man drove 90 minutes each way for a horse nobody in this town has ever laid eyes on." Aurelia's hand tightened on the counter's edge. A horse. Odette's expression shifted, some private calculation crossing behind her eyes. "You didn't know?" It was not a question either. Aurelia did not answer it as one. "I need to speak with someone who worked with him," she said instead. "Anyone who might know what's in that barn." Odette was quiet for a moment, weighing something Aurelia could not see. Then she said a name, reluctant, like she was handing over something she'd rather have kept. "Caleb Thorne. Retired vet. Ornery as a wet cat and twice as likely to bite. But he's the only man alive who's been past that barn door in the last 2 years. Farm's about 4 miles east on Cutter Road. Can't miss the fence. He built it himself, out of spite, he'll tell you, though nobody remembers spite at what anymore. The drive to Cutter Road took her past fields gone fallow, past a church with a crooked steeple, past a cemetery smaller and older than the one where her husband now lay. Caleb Thorne's house sat behind a fence that was, indeed, unmissable, 6 feet of unpainted cedar built with a precision that suggested either great skill or great anger. Possibly both. He answered the door before she knocked, as though he had watched her entire approach from some window she hadn't noticed, and stood in the frame with the stillness of a man who had spent decades reading animals for signs of danger and had simply extended the habit to people. He was older than she expected, perhaps 70, with hands scarred in the particular way of a man who had spent a lifetime working close to teeth and hooves. He looked at her for a long moment, taking in the city coat, the shoes unsuited to gravel, the suitcase fresh posture of someone recently arrived and entirely out of place. "You're smaller than I pictured," he said finally. "I didn't know you'd pictured me at all," she said. "Daniel talked about you. Not often. But when he did," the past tense in his voice was different from the lawyer's, different from Odette's. It carried something she hadn't encountered yet in this whole ordeal. Not sympathy. Something closer to accusation. "I need to know what's in the barn," she said, because there was no version of this conversation that benefited from delay. Thorne's jaw worked once, side to side, an old habit of restraint. Then he stepped back from the door, not quite an invitation, but not quite a refusal either. "You want to know what's in that barn?" he said. "You'd best understand what you're asking. Because that animal in there isn't a pet, and it isn't livestock, and it sure as hell isn't going to explain itself the way your husband could have, if he'd had the decency to stay alive long enough to do it." The words landed with more weight than she expected, and she watched something flicker behind the old man's eyes, quickly suppressed. Grief, she recognized. Not just hers. He was inside that barn every week for 3 years. Thorne continued, voice roughening. "Told me things I promised not to repeat until somebody with a right to know came asking." "Well, you're asking. Then tell me," she said. He studied her a moment longer, weighing something she couldn't see, the way Odette had. Then he shook his head slowly. "Not like this. Not standing on my porch like you're collecting a debt. You want the truth about that horse, you're going to have to earn it the way he did. Go back to that barn. Find a way in. Meet the animal your husband died trying to fix. Then come back and ask me your questions, and I'll answer every one, because you'll finally understand enough to hear them." He shut the door before she could argue, leaving her on the porch with the wind picking up behind her and a name she hadn't asked for yet echoing in her mind. The animal your husband died trying to fix. Not bought, not kept, fixed. As though the horse had been broken before Daniel ever found it. And whatever he'd spent 3 years doing behind that locked door had been an act of repair rather than possession. She drove back to the farm with the fog thickening around the truck's headlights, past the church, past the cemetery, past fields that seemed, in the deepening gray light, to hold their breath. When she reached the drive, she sat in the car for a long moment before going in, looking at the barn's silhouette against a sky the color of a healing bruise. Somewhere behind that locked door, a hoof scraped once against old wood, patient, waiting, as though it, too, understood that something in this story was finally about to begin. It took her 2 days to find a locksmith willing to drive out from the county seat, a thin, unhurried man who smelled of cigarettes and motor oil and studied the padlock a long moment before working it loose with tools that looked more like dental instruments than anything meant for metal. "Whatever's in there," he said, stepping back once the lock finally gave, releasing with a sound like a held breath let go. "Your husband didn't want it getting out. Might want to think on that before you open the door." She waited until his truck disappeared down the fog-thick drive before she allowed herself to approach the barn alone. The door groaned on hinges that had not moved in months, and the smell that rolled out to meet her was not what she expected. Not the ammonia stench of neglect, but something cleaner beneath the staleness. Hay and leather, and the particular must of a space closed too long against weather it had once been built to withstand. Someone had maintained this interior with more care than the house itself. Light fell through gaps in the roof in thin gray columns, illuminating dust that hung suspended, undisturbed, in the stillness. And in the farthest stall, in shadow so deep it took her eyes a long moment to resolve shape from darkness, something moved. A horse, larger than she expected, a deep bay that might once have gleamed but now carried the dullness of an animal that had stopped being groomed, its mane matted, its ribs visible beneath a coat gone rough with neglect. It stood with its head lowered, one ear swiveled toward her, the other still. As it turned, slow and wary, she understood why. The left side of its face bore an old wound, healed but disfiguring, the eye beneath it clouded white and sightless. The horse did not startle. It did not retreat to the back of the stall the way a frightened animal should have. It simply watched her with its remaining eye, still and assessing, the way a person watches a stranger enter a room they've been told is theirs alone. She did not move for a long time. Neither did the horse. The silence between them stretched, heavy with something she could not name, until the animal exhaled, long and low, and turned its head away, as though she had failed some test it hadn't bothered to explain. There was a nameplate on the stall door, tarnished but legible beneath a layer of dust she wiped away with her sleeve. Zephyr. Beneath the name, in Daniel's handwriting, 3 words she read 4 times before she trusted herself to understand them. Patience, not force. She found, in a tack room off the main barn, a logbook filled cover to cover with her husband's cramped script, dates spanning back nearly 3 years, each entry a record of feed adjustments, temperament notes, small victories described with a tenderness she had never once heard in his voice at home. Today he let me touch his neck for the first time. Today he ate from my palm instead of the trough. Today I did not push. Tomorrow, I will not push either. She sat on an overturned bucket in that tack room until the light through the high windows shifted from gray to gold to gray again, reading a version of her husband she had never been introduced to, a man who spoke in whispers to a wounded animal and wrote down its small progress like a father recording a child's first steps. When she finally looked up, Zephyr had moved to the front of his stall, watching her with his one good eye, no longer wary so much as curious, the way a creature watches something it has not yet decided is dangerous. She did not approach him that day. She understood, somehow, without being told, that approaching too soon would undo whatever ground her husband had gained in 3 years of careful, silent work. Instead, she rose, replaced the logbook exactly where she'd found it, and stood at the stall door for a long moment, close enough that the horse could smell her, far enough that he did not need to decide anything yet. Tomorrow, she said quietly, and did not know if she meant it as promise or apology. Behind her, in the tack room she had just left, she noticed for the first time a seam in the floorboards that did not match the grain of the wood around it. A rectangle, precise, deliberate, the kind of imperfection that exists only because someone made it exist. She crouched and pressed her palm against it, and felt, beneath her fingers, the unmistakable give of something hollow. Whatever her husband had built beneath this barn, he had built it to be found only by someone patient enough to sit still long enough to notice. She did not open it that night, but she did not forget it either. And somewhere in the dark stall behind her, Zephyr shifted his weight, watching the door long after she had gone, as though he understood that the woman who had just left was going to come back changed. She returned to the barn every day for a week, and every day the ritual repeated with small, deliberate variations, an inch of progress measured against months of her husband's patience. She brought grain in a bucket, set it just inside the stall door, and sat on the same overturned bucket in the aisle, far enough to not threaten, close enough to be present. She spoke to Zephyr the way she imagined Daniel must have, low and unhurried, though she had none of his words to borrow, so she simply talked. About the drive from the city, about the fog that never seemed to fully lift, about a marriage she was only now beginning to understand had contained rooms she'd never been shown. Zephyr listened the way animals listen, without comprehension but with attention, his ears swiveling toward her voice, his blind side always angled slightly away, a habit of self-preservation so old it had become architecture. On the 4th day, he ate from the bucket while she sat 3 feet away rather than retreating to the stall's far corner first. On the 6th day, he allowed her within arm's reach without flinching his head away. On the 7th, as she reached to smooth a matted section of his mane, more out of habit than plan, he went still in a way that was not fear, but something closer to memory, as though her touch had reminded him of a hand he'd trusted once before. That night, after locking the barn behind her, she finally returned to the tack room's hollow floorboard, and this time, she pried it up. Beneath it was a shallow compartment lined with cedar, the kind a man builds when he wants something to last, and inside it, a metal document box, unlocked, as though her husband had known that whoever found it deserved to see everything without further obstruction. She lifted the lid with hands that had gone unsteady in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. Inside were letters, dozens of them, in Daniel's handwriting, none of them stamped or addressed for mailing, each one beginning the same way. My dearest Aurelia. She sat back against the tack room wall and read the first, then the second, then could not stop, though every one broke something further open in her chest. They were not confessions of an affair, not evidence of the double life she had spent 11 months quietly suspecting. They were something stranger, and in some ways harder to absorb. Daniel had written to her, across 3 years, about a horse she had never met, about the mother she had lost at 19, about a promise he had made to himself the week after her mother's funeral, when Aurelia had mentioned once, in passing, grief-thick and half-forgotten even by herself, that her mother's last horse had been sold at auction to settle estate debts, sold to a buyer who worked animals hard and asked no questions, and that she had never learned what became of him. Daniel had learned. Daniel had spent 8 months tracking an auction record through 3 states, had found a horse blinded in one eye by a previous owner's negligence, deemed unsellable, scheduled for slaughter within the month, and had bought him for less than the price of a used truck, under a name and an LLC she had never seen, because he did not want her to know until the horse was well enough, until the story was whole enough, to give to her as something more than an animal, a restoration, a resurrection of the one piece of her mother she had believed lost forever. Beneath the letters, in a manila folder gone soft at the corners, she found medical records, his own, not the horse's. Appointments at an oncology clinic 2 counties over, the first dated 4 years before his death, the most recent dated 6 weeks before it. Diagnoses in clinical language that took her 3 readings to fully absorb. He had known. For years, he had known, and had spent the borrowed time he had left driving 90 minutes each way in secret. Not toward some hidden lover, not toward some other life, but toward a barn where he sat with a wounded, blind horse and worked, patiently, silently, to give his wife back something she had believed gone forever. The last letter in the box was dated 3 days before his death, the handwriting looser than the others, the strokes of a hand that had grown tired in ways his letters, until then, had refused to admit. He is not ready yet, the letter read. I thought I would have more time to finish this. I thought I would be the one to lead him out of that stall and put the rope in your hands myself and tell you everything. The way I should have told you from the beginning. Instead of turning this into a secret I convinced myself was a gift. I was wrong to let the silence go on this long. I was afraid you would ask me to stop, to rest, to choose myself over this animal and over you. And I did not know how to explain that this was never really about the horse. It was about giving you back a piece of what you lost, because I could not give you back your mother, and I did not know how else to make the unbearable bearable. If you are reading this, I did not get to finish. I am asking you, my dearest Aurelia, to finish it for me. He deserves it. So do you. She sat in the tack room until the light through the high windows had gone entirely to black, the letter trembling in her hands, and outside in his stall, as though he had felt the shift in the air, Zephyr made a sound she had not heard from him before. Not the wary shuffle of a defensive animal. Something closer, if animals were capable of such a thing, to grief recognized in another creature and answered in kind. She had come to this farm believing her husband had died a stranger, a man who had built a hidden life to escape a marriage grown cold. She left the tack room that night understanding the opposite was true, and that understanding, rather than offering comfort, opened something far more dangerous. Because now she knew exactly what she stood to lose if she failed to finish what he started, and exactly how much it would cost her to try. The letter from the county council arrived the following week, its language stiff with the false courtesy of bureaucracy dressed as concern. The farm's outstanding debts, accumulated across 3 years of a dying man's secret veterinary expenses and unpaid property taxes, had reached a sum that made Aurelia's stomach drop when she first read it aloud in the empty kitchen. Attached to the letter was a business card, cream-colored and embossed, belonging to a man named Mr. Farlow, described in a cover note as a broker representing a group of investors with, the letter said, considerable interest in acquiring rural parcels in the region for development. Farlow arrived 2 days later, unannounced, in a car too clean for the gravel drive it navigated, and stepped out wearing a smile that had clearly closed a great many deals it had no business closing. Mrs. Vance, he said, extending a hand she did not take. I understand this is a difficult time. I wanted to offer, in person, out of respect for your husband's memory, a path forward that spares you the burden of debts that, frankly, no woman in your position should have to carry alone. She let him talk. She was learning, often the fastest way to understand exactly what a person wanted. Farlow's offer was generous on paper, enough to clear every debt attached to the property and leave her with a modest sum besides, enough to return to the city and resume a life that made sense, a life with furniture that matched and neighbors who did not know her husband's name attached to hospital appointment records. The only complication, he explained, glancing toward the barn with an expression that flickered, briefly, into something colder, was the animal. The horse presents a liability, he said, blind in one eye, unregistered, no clear provenance, and frankly, given his temperament, a danger to any future development crew on site. Our recommendation, and I want to be transparent with you here, Mrs. Vance, because I respect you too much for anything less, would be humane euthanasia prior to closing. It simplifies the transaction considerably, and honestly, it would be a mercy. An animal like that has no real future. Aurelia did not answer immediately. She looked past him, toward the barn, where Zephyr's silhouette was visible through the open doors, head raised, ears forward, watching the strange car and the stranger's voice with an attention that seemed, in that moment, almost too aware for an animal supposedly without a future. "I'll need time to consider the offer," she said finally, and something in her voice must have carried more warning than she intended, because Farlow's smile thinned at the edges before he recovered it. "Of course," he said, "though I should mention, the offer has a window. Investors like these don't wait indefinitely, and given the debt structure, Mrs. Vance, time is rarely on the side of the property owner." He left his card on the porch rail, weighted down with a small stone as though he had anticipated her not inviting him inside long enough to hand it to her properly, and drove off down the fog-wet drive with the particular unhurried confidence of a man who believed the outcome was already decided. That evening, she called her sister, the first family conversation she'd had since arriving, and found no comfort there either. "Come home, Aurelia," her sister said, voice tight with the particular exasperation of someone who loved her but had run out of patience for her grief. "You're chasing a ghost through a barn in the middle of nowhere. Daniel is gone. Whatever secret he was keeping, it doesn't change that. Sell the farm. Pay off what he left you. Come back to a life that makes sense." "I found his letters," Aurelia said quietly. "I know why he was out there." Her sister was silent for a moment. Then, gentler but no less firm, "That doesn't mean you owe it to him to ruin your own life finishing it. Grief makes people do foolish things, Aurelia. Don't let this be yours." The call ended without resolution, and Aurelia stood in the kitchen a long while afterward, looking at the calendar on the wall with its red circle around an ordinary Tuesday in March, understanding now that the date marked the day Daniel had learned his cancer had metastasized, a diagnosis he had absorbed alone in a clinic 2 counties away, and then driven, without stopping, to a barn where a blind horse waited for him, because it was easier, apparently, to face mortality in the company of a creature who could not ask him to explain it. She walked out to the barn in the deepening dark, without a coat, without the caution the fog and cold demanded, and stood at Zephyr's stall until he approached the door on his own, the first time he had crossed the distance without her having first offered grain or patience or time. He lowered his head, not quite touching her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of his breath against her collarbone, and she stood very still, the way the logbook had taught her, the way 3 years of her dead husband's careful patience had taught this animal to expect from anyone who came close. "I'm not selling you," she said, to an animal that could not understand the words but seemed, in the stillness of that moment, to understand the tone beneath them. "Whatever it costs. I'm not selling you." Behind her, unnoticed until the beam of a flashlight swept briefly across the barn's open doors and retreated just as quickly into the dark, someone had been watching from the tree line. She would not learn until later that Caleb Thorne had begun a habit, each evening at dusk, of driving past the farm slowly enough to see whether the barn lights were on, whether the woman from the city had given up yet, or whether, against every expectation the town had quietly settled on, she was still trying. The storm arrived on a Thursday, rolling in off the coast with a suddenness the local radio described, in tones of mild alarm, as the first major system of the season, wind gusts strong enough to strip the last of autumn's leaves from branches in a single violent afternoon. Aurelia had spent the morning reinforcing the barn's weaker seams with plywood scraps she'd found in the tool shed, working with hands blistered from a hammer she'd never held with purpose before, and by the time the first heavy rain began, she believed she had done enough. She had not accounted for what the storm's pressure would do to an animal already carrying old trauma in his body. She heard it before she saw it, a sound unlike anything Zephyr had made before, a low, repetitive groan that carried through the barn's walls even over the wind. And when she reached his stall, she found him down on his side in the straw, legs drawn tight against his belly, sweat darkening his coat despite the cold. His one good eye rolled back with an expression she recognized, with a lurch of dread, from every warning she had read in her husband's logbook. Colic. The word Daniel had underlined twice in his own careful hand, with a note beneath it that had chilled her the first time she'd read it, and now returned with the force of prophecy. If it happens, do not panic, and do not give him anything stronger than what the vet approves. His heart cannot tolerate the standard sedation. Call Thorne. Only Thorne. She called Caleb Thorne with hands shaking so badly she misdialed twice before the call connected, and his voice, when it came through, was clipped and immediate in a way that told her he understood the stakes before she'd finished the sentence. "Storm's already flooded the low bridge on Cutter Road," he said. "I can't get a truck through tonight. You're going to have to manage the first hour yourself, and I'm going to walk you through it on this phone, and you are not going to hang up on me no matter how frightened you get. Do you understand?" "I understand," she said, though she did not yet, understand how much the next hour would demand of her. Under his direction, relayed in a voice that never once rose or softened, she kept Zephyr on his feet through sheer stubborn insistence, walking him in slow circles around the barn aisle because lying still, Thorne explained, risked a fatal twist in the horse's gut. She walked him through cramps that made his whole body seize, through a wind outside that tore a section of the barn's north wall loose with a crack like a gunshot, her own body soaked through with rain finding its way through the broken roof, her voice hoarse from a constant low murmur of words that made no sense and mattered anyway. Thorne talked her through the danger points, the moments when Zephyr's breathing grew too shallow, when his gums, checked by flashlight with fingers that would not stop trembling, went pale in a way that made her voice crack down the phone line with a fear she no longer tried to hide. "He's not going to make it," she said at one point, the words torn from her by exhaustion and terror in equal measure. "I can't do this. I don't know how to do this." "You're already doing it," Thorne said, and something in his voice, gruff and unpracticed at comfort, cracked just slightly at the edges. "Daniel spent 3 years teaching that animal to trust a human hand again. You think he'd have chosen just anybody to be there the night it mattered most? Keep walking, Mrs. Vance. Keep walking and keep talking to him, because that horse doesn't need a vet right now nearly as much as he needs to hear that somebody isn't leaving." She kept walking. Through the second hour, through the worst of the storm, through a moment near 4 in the morning when Zephyr's legs buckled and she thought, with a certainty that hollowed her chest, that she was about to watch him die in her arms the way she'd watched Daniel die in a hospital bed 11 months before, powerless against something too large to fight. But he did not go down. He shuddered, staggered, found his footing again, and pressed his head once more into her chest. And this time, when she wrapped both arms around his neck without thinking of hooves or teeth or the danger a panicking animal represents, he went still. Not defeated. Something closer to surrender. The good kind. The kind that comes only after a body has fought as hard as it can and finally allows itself to be held. By the time the storm broke, gray dawn light bleeding weakly through the barn's shattered north wall, Zephyr's breathing had slowed to something approaching normal, his sides no longer heaving. His good eye no longer rolled back in pain. Aurelia sat in the straw beside him, soaked, exhausted, hands raw and bleeding in places she hadn't noticed happening, and did not move for a long while, simply breathing alongside an animal who had, against every reasonable expectation, chosen to keep living. Caleb Thorne arrived an hour later, once the flooded bridge had receded enough to cross, and found her exactly there, asleep sitting upright against the stall wall, one hand still resting on Zephyr's neck. He stood in the barn's ruined doorway for a long moment, taking in the scene with an expression she would not see, and would not have understood the weight of even if she had. Something between vindication and grief, an old man watching a stranger succeed at the very task he'd half hoped, out of some complicated loyalty to a dead friend, that she would fail. He did not wake her right away. He simply crouched, checked the horse's vitals with the practiced hands of 40 years, and confirmed what her exhausted body already sensed. The animal had survived the night, and so, in a way that would prove harder to define but no less true, had she. The barn's north wall took 3 days to repair, and in that time, something in the town's quiet skepticism began, almost imperceptibly, to shift. Odette at the feed store began setting aside the specific grain mixture Daniel's logbook had recorded without being asked. A neighbor Aurelia had never met left a stack of salvaged lumber at the end of the drive with no note attached. Caleb Thorne began stopping by most afternoons, ostensibly to check on Zephyr's recovery, though the visits stretched longer each time, and the silences between them grew less guarded. It was during one of these visits, the two of them sitting on overturned buckets in the barn aisle, while Zephyr grazed contentedly nearby on a lead line for the first time in years, that Thorne finally answered the question she had come to his porch to ask. weeks before. He knew he was dying before he ever set foot in this barn, Thorne said, without preamble, staring at some point past her shoulder. Came to me the week after his diagnosis, sat right where you're sitting now, and told me he wanted to find that horse. I told him he was out of his mind. Man's got maybe 3, for years if he's lucky, and he wants to spend it chasing down an auction record for an animal that might already be dead for all he knew. He just looked at me and said something I've turned over in my head every day since. What did he say? Aurelia asked, quiet. He said, if I only have a little time left, I want to spend it finishing something instead of starting something new. He said you'd lost so much already, and he couldn't fix the losing, but maybe he could fix one small piece of it, quietly, so that when he was gone, you'd have something whole instead of one more thing broken. Thorne's voice had roughened by the end, and he looked away, toward the pasture, giving himself a moment before continuing. I helped him find the horse. Helped him buy him under that shell company so nobody could trace it back and ruin the surprise. Watched him drive out here every week for 3 years. Watched this animal go from something that flinched at every hand near his face to something that would let a dying man rest his head against its neck for an hour at a time. Like the horse was giving him back some of the comfort he couldn't ask for anywhere else. He never once complained about the drive, or the cost, or the treatments getting harder while the horse's progress got slower. He just kept coming back, right up until the week he couldn't anymore. Why didn't he tell me? Aurelia asked, and the question, when it finally left her, carried less anger than she expected and more simple grief. Thorne considered this for a long moment. Because he was afraid, he said finally, that you'd tell him to stop, that you'd see a dying man spending what little strength he had left on a stubborn, half-blind horse instead of on you, and you'd make him choose, and he was terrified that if you made him choose, he'd choose you, and never finish what he started. He wasn't hiding an affair, Mrs. Vance. He was hiding a race against his own body, because he thought finishing it alone was the only way to guarantee he'd finish it at all. Aurelia sat with this in silence, watching Zephyr graze a few feet away, his blind side turned instinctively toward the barn, his good eye occasionally flicking toward her as though checking, still, that she remained. That doesn't make the silence hurt less, she said finally. No, Thorne agreed. It probably doesn't. But there's a difference between a man who lies to protect himself and a man who lies because he's terrified of losing the last thing he's trying to give you. I don't imagine that makes forgiving him simple, but I hope it makes it possible. He rose, joints protesting audibly, and paused at the barn door before leaving. For what it's worth, he said, I didn't think you'd last 2 weeks out here. Told Odette as much. First day she mentioned you'd come back. I was wrong. Men could have done worse, picking somebody stubborn enough to finish what he started. He left before she could respond, and she sat a long while longer in the barn aisle, Zephyr's steady grazing the only sound beneath the wind, understanding for the first time that the version of her marriage she had grieved for 11 months, a marriage built on silence and distance, and a husband slowly becoming a stranger, had never been the true one. The true one had been built on an act of devotion so quiet, so entirely without need for acknowledgement, that it had taken his death and a blind horse's slow recovery to finally bring it into the light. That night, for the first time since the funeral, she wept. Not the brittle, controlled grief she had allowed herself in the city, careful and contained behind closed doors, but something larger, uglier, and far more necessary, her whole body shaking with it, sitting in the straw with her arms around a horse who leaned his weight gently into her shoulder and stayed exactly still, as though he understood, in whatever way animals understand such things, that this was the moment he had been waiting 3 years, and one storm, and one dead man's quiet devotion to help her finally reach. Mr. Farlow's second visit arrived with considerably less patience than his first. He stood on the porch with his cream-colored card nowhere in evidence this time, his smile absent entirely, replaced by the brisk irritation of a man accustomed to deals closing on his schedule rather than anyone else's. Mrs. Vance, he said, I'll be direct. The investment group's window closes at the end of this month. After that, the offer withdraws entirely, and given the debt structure on this property, I want to be clear that the county will move to foreclosure proceedings considerably less generous than anything currently on the table. I understand there's been some sentimental attachment forming, he added, glancing toward the barn with an expression of thin condescension, but sentiment doesn't pay debts, and that horse certainly won't be paying yours. I'm not selling, Aurelius said. Farlow's jaw tightened. Then I hope you understand what you're choosing instead. A foreclosed property with no equity, an animal with no market value, and, from what I understand, a temperament that makes him a liability rather than an asset, and a debt that will follow you regardless of what happens to this land. This isn't a fairy tale, Mrs. Vance. This is a balance sheet. After he left, Aurelia sat at the kitchen table with the county's letters spread before her, the numbers as unforgiving in the daylight as they'd been the first time she read them. She had exactly one path left that did not involve losing the farm, the barn, and the animal her husband had spent his final years quietly resurrecting. She would have to liquidate what remained of her own life in the city, the apartment she still technically held, the modest inheritance from her mother she'd kept untouched, the jewelry that had been Daniel's gifts across a decade together, to cover debts that were never truly hers to inherit but had become hers regardless, the moment she chose to stay. She called her sister once more, not for permission, but because some part of her needed to say the decision aloud to someone who would understand its cost. You're going to lose everything, her sister said, voice tight with something between fear and frustration. The apartment, the savings, all of it, for a farm that isn't even profitable and a horse that isn't even yours. He's mine now, Aurelia said, and heard, in her own voice, a certainty she had not possessed in 11 months of grief. Daniel spent the last years of his life proving that some things are worth finishing even when it costs you everything to do it. I'm not going to be the one who lets it end unfinished. Her sister was silent for a long moment. Then, quieter, you've changed since you went out there. I know, Aurelia said. I think that might be the point. She signed the liquidation paperwork the following week, in a lawyer's office in the county seat, watching numbers that represented the entire architecture of her old life converted, line by line, into numbers that would keep a blind horse and a ruined farm out of a stranger's development plans. It did not feel like sacrifice in the way she expected. It felt, instead, like a debt of her own finally being paid, though to whom, or for what, she could not have fully articulated even to herself. When she returned to the farm that evening, Caleb Thorne's truck was parked in the drive, and he stood waiting at the barn door with an expression she had not seen on him before, something almost gentle beneath the customary gruffness. Farlow's group pulled their offer this morning, he said. Word travels fast in a county this size. Whole town's been placing bets on whether you'd fold. He paused, glancing toward Zephyr, who stood at the pasture fence watching them both with his good eye, ears forward, alert in a way that had become, over these past weeks, entirely his own rather than a shadow of old fear. Seems you didn't. No, Aurelia said. I didn't. Thorne nodded slowly, something settling behind his eyes that looked, for the first time since she'd met him, like respect freely given rather than grudgingly withheld. Man like Daniel, he said, he'd have been glad to know he picked right. She did not answer, because there was nothing left to say that the moment itself did not already say more eloquently. Behind them, the fog rolled in low across the pasture, and Zephyr lowered his head to graze, unhurried, unafraid, entirely at home in a place that had very nearly, and for reasons that had nothing to do with him, almost been taken away. Winter arrived properly in the weeks that followed, hard frost silvering the pasture each morning, and Aurelia settled into a rhythm of labor she had never once imagined for herself in the life she'd left behind. Mucking stalls before dawn, repairing fence line with hands that had long since abandoned any pretense of delicacy, learning from Thorne, patiently, and without flattery, the 1,000 small competencies a working farm demanded. She was not good at any of it, not yet, and some mornings the exhaustion settled into her bones with a weight that made her question, briefly, whether her sister's warnings had carried more truth than she'd allowed herself to admit. But each evening, when the light went gold and then gray over the western fence line, she found her way to Zephyr's stall, and the reward waiting there made every aching muscle, every liquidated asset, every raised eyebrow from a sister who could not understand, feel entirely, unassailably worth it. He had begun, in these past weeks, to seek her out rather than simply tolerate her presence, crossing the pasture at the sound of her voice, resting his weight against the fence when she approached rather than eyeing her from a wary distance. The blind side that had once turned instinctively away from any approaching hand now turned toward her without hesitation. A trust so complete it startled her sometimes, standing in the frosted pasture at dusk, to realize how far this animal had traveled from the creature who had once scraped a hoof against a locked door in warning. It was on one such evening, the frost just beginning to silver the grass and her breath visible in the cooling air, that Zephyr did something he had never done before, not once in all the weeks of patient, careful progress. He crossed the last few feet between them unbidden, lowered his great head, and pressed his forehead gently against her chest, holding the contact with a stillness that felt, in every way that mattered, deliberate. Aurelia stood very still, arms slowly rising to circle his neck the way she had during the storm. Though this time there was no crisis to answer, no panic to soothe. This was simply an animal choosing closeness for its own sake, offering the one gesture of trust that could not be taught, only earned, across months of patience that asked nothing in return. Something in her chest, held tight and guarded since a hospital room 11 months before, finally gave way entirely. She wept there in the frost-silvered dusk, her face pressed against the horse's neck, grief and gratitude and something that might, at last, have been the beginning of peace, all arriving together in a wave she no longer had the strength or the desire to hold back. Zephyr did not move. He stood exactly as he was, patient and warm and solid, absorbing a grief he could not understand but seemed, in whatever way horses understand such things, entirely willing to carry. When the tears finally slowed, she straightened, wiping her face with a sleeve gone rough from months of physical work, and looked at the animal before her with something that had not been present in any of her earlier visits to this barn. Not obligation, not even sacrifice. Something closer, simply, to love, arrived at last through the long and unglamorous labor of patience. The same patience her husband had practiced here for 3 years before her. The same patience his final letter had asked her to carry forward. She understood, standing there in the gathering dark, that this was what he had meant. Not the horse alone, though the horse mattered, would always matter. But this, the slow, unspectacular work of proving to something broken that it was safe to trust again, and the answering grace of watching that trust, finally, freely given. Spring came to the farm in increments, the fog lifting earlier each morning, the pasture greening in patches that spread, week by week, into a solid carpet Aurelia had not seen since her first uncertain arrival the previous autumn. The barn's north wall stood fully repaired now, its new lumber not yet weathered to match the old, a visible seam of before and after that she had chosen, deliberately, not to disguise. She had converted the old milking parlor, in the months since the storm, into a modest intake facility, following a plan sketched first on the back of an envelope and then, with growing confidence, into a proper proposal she had shown to Thorne one evening over coffee at her kitchen table. A sanctuary, not a hobby farm, for animals the market considered unsellable, the injured, the aged, the blind, the difficult, given a place to be something other than a liability awaiting disposal. Thorne had read the proposal in silence, twice, before looking up at her with an expression she had learned, by now, to recognize as his version of genuine surprise. "This is a real operation," he said. "Not just you and one horse anymore." "That's the idea," she said. "If you're willing to consult." Officially, this time, instead of just taking pity calls in the middle of a storm, he had agreed, with considerably less reluctance than she expected, and in the months since, 2 more animals had arrived at the farm's gate, referred quietly through channels that seemed to have opened, almost of their own accord. Once word spread through the county that the widow at the old Vance place wasn't selling and wasn't going anywhere. An aged mare no longer able to work, surrendered rather than put down by an owner who could not otherwise afford her care. A gelding with a shattered leg healed poorly, considered too great a liability for any working farm to keep. Zephyr, through it all, had become something Aurelia had not anticipated when she first stood outside his locked stall listening to a hoof scrape warily against rotted wood. He had become, in his quiet, patient way, a kind of anchor for the animals that followed him, standing calm at the fence line while newer arrivals paced and startled at unfamiliar sounds, offering a stillness the others seemed, gradually, to learn from. It was on a bright morning in April, the kind of clear day the Oregon hills rarely offered without qualification, that Aurelia finally opened the last of the letters she had kept unread in the metal document box, unable, until now, to face what she suspected it might contain. It was different from the others, shorter, written in a hand that trembled with an effort she recognized now as the final physical cost of his illness. "If you've made it this far," the letter read, "then you've met him properly by now, and I suspect you already understand things I spent too long being afraid to say aloud. I want you to know that loving you never once felt like a burden, even in the hardest months, even when I couldn't tell you why I was tired or why I needed to disappear 3 days a week to a farm you didn't know existed. I want you to know that every hour I spent with that horse, I spent thinking about your mother's stories, about the horse she used to talk about before she got sick, about the particular way your face changed whenever you mentioned him, like some good part of your childhood lived entirely in that memory. I couldn't save your mother. I couldn't, in the end, save myself. But I could give you this one thing whole. If I was patient enough and quiet enough, and if you were ever brave enough to come looking for what I left behind. I believe you are. I have always believed you are braver than either of us gave you credit for. Whatever this farm costs you, whatever this animal asks of you, I promise you it is worth less than what you will get back in return. I love you. I am sorry it took dying to finally prove it properly. Finish what I started. I'll be watching, in whatever way the dead are allowed to watch the living they leave behind." She sat with the letter a long while in the April sun, and when she finally rose and walked out to the pasture, Zephyr lifted his head at her approach, ears forward, good eye bright in the clear light, and crossed the grass to meet her without hesitation, the way he had learned, at last, that some approaches did not require caution. She pressed her forehead against his, the way he had once pressed his against her chest in the frost-silvered dusk of that first true breakthrough, and stood there a long while in the bright spring morning, grief and gratitude no longer opposing forces, but something woven together at last into a single, sustainable piece. "I finished it," she said quietly, to a husband who could not hear her and a horse who did not need the words to understand the moment. "We finished it." The sanctuary bore no official sign for its first full year, word of it traveling instead the way most things traveled through this county, mouth to mouth, farm to farm, until the quiet operation behind the old Vance place had a waiting list longer than its current capacity could support. Aurelia hired her first part-time hand that autumn, a taciturn young woman named Ruth who had grown up 2 farms over and asked no questions about why the widow from the city had stayed, only whether the new mare's feed schedule needed adjusting. Caleb Thorne came by most days still, though the visits had lost entirely their original character of skepticism, replaced by something that had become, without either of them quite naming it, close to family. He taught Ruth the things he had once taught Aurelia, standing at the fence line in the late afternoon light, gruff and exacting and, beneath it, entirely devoted to a place he had once doubted would survive its first season. Aurelia visited Daniel's grave that following spring, the first anniversary of his death, and stood there a long while in a way she had not been able to manage the year before, when grief had still felt like something done to her rather than something she was learning, slowly, to carry. "I kept him," she told the headstone, quiet in the way she had learned to be quiet around Zephyr, around Thorne, around a version of herself she had not known existed before this farm demanded she become it. "I kept all of it. It's not the life either of us imagined. It's better, in ways I don't think either of us had the courage to imagine." She did not stay long. Grief, she had come to understand, was not a debt that closed with a single payment, but something carried forward, transformed by use rather than erased by time. She drove back to the farm as the fog began its evening retreat over the hills, and found Zephyr waiting at the pasture fence, the way he waited most evenings now, ears forward, good eye bright, entirely unafraid of a woman who had once been a stranger and had become, through nothing more dramatic than patience faithfully kept, the one thing in this world he trusted completely. She rested her hand against his neck, feeling the warmth of him beneath her palm, and looked out over a pasture greening into another spring, a barn repaired, a sanctuary growing, a life built not from the ashes of what she'd lost, but from the quiet, unglamorous labor of finishing what someone she loved had been too afraid, and too dying, to finish alone. Some debts, she understood now, standing in that gathering dusk with a blind horse breathing steady and calm beside her, are paid not in money, and not in time, but in the simple, difficult act of staying, when every reasonable voice around you insists that leaving would be easier. Daniel had stayed, quietly, faithfully, across 3 years of a dying man's remaining strength, for a horse that could never thank him, and a wife who would not learn the truth of it until after he was gone. And she had stayed, in turn, for a farm that owed her nothing, for an animal that had asked her for nothing but patience, for a marriage she had grieved as broken and discovered, in the end, had simply been quiet in the particular, devastating way that true love sometimes is, when it chooses to give everything and explain nothing until the explaining can no longer be delayed. The fog rolled back in fully as night settled over the hills, but for the first time since her arrival at this farm, Aurelia did not feel the particular cold that had greeted her that first evening, standing at the edge of a gravel drive with a suitcase and a stack of confusing paperwork. She felt, instead, something that had taken a blind horse, a ruined barn, a storm, a stubborn old veterinarian, and the patient, silent devotion of a dying man to finally teach her that the truest love rarely announces itself in the comfort of easy words. It reveals itself, instead, in the sacrifices made quietly, in the dark, by someone determined to heal what was broken, long before they ever expected anyone to notice the mending had happened at all. If this story moved you the way it moved us to tell it, let us know where you're watching from, and stay close, because the next story is already waiting in the fog.